Welcome to War Bios, the podcast where we delve into the most pivotal conflicts in history, and I'm your host, General Biography. Today, we're going to explore one of the most brutal and forgotten battles of World War II, the Rzhev meat grinder. This campaign, fought between 1942 and 1943, was a series of battles that took place in the Rzhev salient, a region in western Russia that became a killing zone for both German and Soviet forces. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union that caught the Red Army off guard. The initial German advances were swift and decisive, with the Wehrmacht pushing deep into Soviet territory. However, as the winter of 1941-42 set in, the Soviet Union began to mobilize its vast resources and launch a series of counterattacks. One of the key objectives for the Soviet Union was to retake the city of Moscow, which had been threatened by the German advance. The Rzhev salient, located about 150 miles west of Moscow, was a crucial stronghold that controlled access to the city. In October 1941, German forces had occupied the Rzhev salient, and since then, it had become a thorn in the side of the Soviet Union. The Soviet forces tasked with retaking the Rzhev salient were led by General Ivan Konev, a seasoned commander who had fought in several key battles against the Germans. Konev's army, known as the Kalinin Front, was composed of veteran troops who had been bloodied in previous battles and were eager to take revenge on their enemies. As the Soviet forces prepared to launch their attack, the German army was undergoing a significant transformation. The new commander of the German Ninth Army, General Walter Model, had arrived on the scene, bringing with him a reputation for tactical brilliance and a deep understanding of the Soviet military. Model's appointment would prove to be a turning point in the Rzhev meat grinder, as he would implement innovative defensive strategies that would inflict heavy casualties on the Soviet forces. General Model was a master of defensive warfare, and he quickly set about fortifying the German positions around Rzhev. He established a series of strongpoints, including bunkers, trenches, and machine gun nests, which were designed to channel the Soviet attacks into killing zones. The Germans also laid extensive minefields and barbed wire entanglements, which would slow down the Soviet advance and give the German defenders time to respond. The Soviet Union had been rapidly modernizing its military, introducing new tanks, aircraft, and artillery systems. However, the Germans had also been innovating, developing advanced defensive technologies such as the Panther tank and the 88mm anti-tank gun. The Soviet Union was determined to retake the Rzhev salient, while the German army was equally determined to hold its ground. In the summer of 1942, the Soviet forces launched a series of attacks against the German Ninth Army, hoping to break through their defenses and retake the Rzhev salient. The initial Soviet advances were promising, but they soon ran into stiff resistance from the German forces. The Germans had established a strong defensive line, anchored on the city of Rzhev, which controlled access to the surrounding countryside. As the battle raged on, both sides suffered heavy casualties. The Soviet forces were unable to break through the German defenses, while the Germans were struggling to hold their ground against the relentless Soviet attacks. The Rzhev salient was becoming a meat grinder, with both sides feeding troops into the killing zone in a desperate bid for victory. The first major action of the Rzhev meat grinder took place in July 1942, when the Soviet forces launched a massive assault on the German defenses around Rzhev. The attack was led by General Konev's Kalinin Front, which had been reinforced with fresh troops and equipment. The Soviet forces advanced across the open countryside, hoping to catch the Germans off guard and break through their defenses. However, the Germans were ready for them. General Model had anticipated the Soviet attack and had prepared a series of defensive positions, including minefields, barbed wire, and machine gun nests. As the Soviet forces approached, they were met with a hail of bullets and artillery fire, which cut down thousands of troops in a matter of minutes. The sound of gunfire and explosions filled the air as the Soviet forces pushed forward, driven by their determination to retake the Rzhev salient. The Germans, however, were equally determined to hold their ground, and they fought back with every ounce of strength they had. As the battle raged on, the Rzhev salient was becoming a charnel house, with both sides suffering appalling losses. The Soviet forces were unable to break through the German defenses, and they suffered heavy casualties in the process. The Germans, on the other hand, had successfully defended their positions, but at great cost. The Soviet Union lost tens of thousands of troops in the battle, while the Germans suffered significant casualties as well. The Rzhev salient would remain a contested territory for months to come, with both sides trading blows and suffering heavy losses. The battle began with a ferocious artillery barrage, as Soviet guns pounded the German positions around Polunino with a hail of shells and rockets. The ground shook beneath the feet of the German defenders as they huddled in their trenches and bunkers, waiting for the inevitable infantry assault to follow. And follow it did, as waves of Soviet troops surged forward across the muddy fields and ravines, their rifles and machine guns blazing as they sought to overwhelm the German defenses. The fighting was intense and chaotic, with both sides suffering heavy casualties as they clashed in the close quarters of the battlefield. The Soviet forces were initially able to make some gains, capturing several key positions and pushing the Germans back on their heels. But the Germans were quick to regroup and counterattack, using their superior artillery and air power to devastating effect. As General Model himself noted, "The Russians are like a dog with a bone, they just won't let go." The Soviet forces were indeed relentless in their pursuit of victory, but the Germans were equally determined to hold their ground. As the battle raged on, the landscape around Polunino became increasingly scarred and devastated. The once green fields were now pockmarked with craters and littered with the wreckage of destroyed tanks and aircraft. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and cordite, and the sound of gunfire and explosions filled the air. It was a grim and brutal fight, with both sides suffering heavy losses as they clashed in the muddy trenches and ravines. The Soviet forces relied heavily on their numerical superiority and the bravery of their troops to try and break through the German defenses. But the Germans had a few tricks up their sleeve, using their superior tactics and training to maximum effect. They employed cleverly laid minefields and booby traps to slow down the Soviet advance, and their artillery and air power were used to devastating effect to cut off and isolate Soviet units. The Soviet forces had managed to capture the village of Polunino, but at great cost in lives and equipment. The Germans, on the other hand, had successfully defended their positions and held off the Soviet advance, buying themselves precious time to regroup and prepare for the next round of fighting. In October 1942, the Soviet forces launched another major assault on the German defenses around Rzhev, hoping to finally break through and capture the strategic city. The attack was led by General Konev's Kalinin front, which had been reinforced with fresh troops and equipment. The Soviet forces advanced across the open countryside, using their superior numbers and artillery power to try and overwhelm the German defenders. The battle raged on for weeks, with both sides suffering heavy casualties as they clashed in the muddy trenches and ravines surrounding Rzhev. The Soviet forces made some gains, capturing several key positions and pushing the Germans back on their heels. But the Germans were quick to regroup and counterattack, using their superior air power and artillery to devastating effect. The Soviet forces had made some gains, but at great cost in lives and equipment. The Germans, on the other hand, had successfully defended their positions and held off the Soviet advance, buying themselves precious time to regroup and prepare for the next round of fighting. The winter of 1942-43 would prove to be a particularly brutal period for both sides as they struggled to survive in the harsh conditions of the Russian winter. The Soviet forces launched several smaller-scale attacks against the German defenses around Rzhev, hoping to wear them down and gain a foothold in the salient. But the Germans were well prepared for the winter fighting, using their superior logistics and equipment to stay warm and fed, while the Soviet forces struggled to survive. The Soviet troops huddled in their trenches and bunkers, trying to stay warm as the temperatures plummeted and the snowdrifts deepened. They were poorly equipped for the winter fighting, with inadequate clothing and insufficient supplies of food and fuel. The Germans, on the other hand, had prepared carefully for the winter, stockpiling food and fuel and issuing warm clothing and equipment to their troops. As the spring of 1943 approached, the Rzhev salient would remain a major flashpoint in the war on the Eastern Front, with both sides trading blows and suffering heavy losses in a desperate bid for victory. The Soviet forces would continue to launch wave after wave of attacks against the German defenses, hoping to finally break through and capture the strategic city. But the Germans would prove to be a formidable foe, using every trick in the book to hold off the Soviet advance and defend their positions in the Rzhev salient. The battle for Rzhev had become a war of attrition, with both sides suffering heavy losses as they clashed in the muddy trenches and ravines. The Soviet forces were determined to break through the German defenses and retake the initiative, but the Germans were equally determined to hold their ground. As the fighting continued, it became clear that the Rzhev salient would remain a major battleground for months to come, with both sides suffering heavy losses in a desperate bid for victory. The Soviet forces, now better equipped and supplied, launched a series of powerful offensives against the German defenses, aiming to finally break through and capture the strategic city of Rzhev. The commander of the Soviet Western Front, General Vasily Sokolovsky, a seasoned veteran of the Eastern Front, understood the importance of adapting to the changing circumstances on the battlefield. He recognized that the key to success lay in harnessing the power of combined arms warfare, where artillery, infantry, and armor worked in tandem to shatter the German defenses. In March 1943, Operation Buffalo was launched, a massive assault on the German defenses around Rzhev. The attack was preceded by an intense artillery bombardment, which caught the German forces off guard and weakened their positions. The Soviet troops advanced rapidly, pushing the Germans back and capturing key strongpoints in the salient. As they pushed forward, they encountered the eerie landscape of a battlefield, abandoned trenches, rusting hulks of tanks, and the makeshift graves of fallen comrades. By the end of March, the Soviet forces had broken through the German lines and were closing in on Rzhev. The city, once a thriving hub of commerce and industry, was now a mere shadow of its former self, its buildings reduced to rubble and its streets littered with the detritus of war. As the Soviet troops approached, they could feel the weight of history upon them, for they knew that the capture of Rzhev would mark a significant turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. The German forces, however, refused to give up, and they launched a series of desperate counterattacks to try and hold off the Soviet advance. The fighting was fierce and intense, with both sides suffering heavy losses. In the end, it was the Soviet forces who emerged victorious, capturing Rzhev on March 31, 1943. As the city fell, the Soviet soldiers were met with a mix of emotions, relief, exhaustion, and a deep sense of pride in their accomplishment. The fall of Rzhev marked the end of the Rzhev salient and a significant turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. General Sokolovsky observed, "The capture of Rzhev was a major victory for our forces, and it marked the beginning of the end of the German occupation of Soviet territory." The Rzhev meat grinder, as it came to be known, had been a brutal and devastating campaign, with both sides suffering staggering losses. Estimates suggest that over 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded during the fighting, making it one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Second World War. Today, the legacy of the Rzhev meat grinder can be seen in the modern Russian military, which continues to prioritize the development of powerful artillery and mechanized forces. In Russia, the Rzhev meat grinder is commemorated as a heroic victory, with numerous monuments and memorials dedicated to the soldiers who fought and died during the campaign. The city of Rzhev itself has been rebuilt, its streets once again filled with the sounds of commerce and industry. However, the scars of war still linger, a poignant reminder of the devastating consequences of conflict. The campaign marked a major shift in the balance of power on the Eastern Front, paving the way for the Soviet advance into Germany and ultimately contributing to the defeat of Nazi Germany. That's all for today's War Bios. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, I'm General Biography reminding you to keep marching toward victory.